Hey everyone, welcome to Love Bytes, a YouTube series brought to you by the Shipping Room podcast, where we will be interviewing authors and actors and television writers, creators of all kinds, to talk about the ships that they have created. So this episode, our first episode ever, I am joined by Amanda Foody, who is the author of the Shadow Games series. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, I'm honored to be here on the very first episode ever.
I am so excited to have you. I have to shout out Samantha Martin, who works for Frolic Media, who was a guest on our podcast a few weeks ago and who recommended your series. And I've since read the whole thing and was like, that's who I want to talk to for the first episode of this series.
Yes, I'm so happy to hear that.
I loved it so much. Before we dive into the book specifically, I wanted to know who some of your favorite fictional characters are or fictional couples are, like from growing up or anyone who's influenced you, and like if any of those couples played a role in influencing any of the romances in this series of books.
Oh, wow, that's a good question. And to be honest, I feel like I'm rarely asked about my favorite fictional characters through the lens of my favorite fictional couples. I think one that immediately comes to mind, I was a huge fan of Anne of Green Gables when I was young, and Anne and Gilbert Blythe. I think Gilbert Blythe was probably my first like love interest love when I was a little kid. So I think them together, and their relationship is one of those classic, I think enemies to lovers is a strong word, but like hate to love, and that we see so much of. I think it's become even more popular as time went on. And I definitely love that one. Ooh, I feel put on the spot there to come up with some more. It's honestly one that's also coming to mind from television. I'm a big fan of Yuri on Ice. If you are at all familiar with the anime, it's an amazing anime show. It's very short too. Yeah, it's a season. I think the second season is finally coming out this fall, but it's entirely about figure skating. And it is also LGBTQ, and the whole season is maybe 13 episodes, so you could watch it in an entire sitting very easily, or at least I can. And the two characters in that show like immediately come to mind as one of my favorite romance themed television shows.
Awesome. So I loved the Shadow Game series. I loved all three books. I feel like there's so much to talk about as far as the romances, but the first thing I wanted to ask you is that I finished the first book, Ace of Shades, and I was shocked out of my mind that Levi and Anne didn't have their moment, their first kiss in that first book. So I wanted to ask you if you always knew that was going to be the case, that they weren't gonna have that kiss until the second book, or if that's sort of how that happened and why that decision was important for you.
Yeah, so Ace of Shades as a novel only takes place over the span of about 10 days. And at the beginning of those 10 days, Levi and Anne are definitely off to a pretty rocky start relationship-wise. They do not immediately like one another. And so taking them from the beginning of that story all the way to the end, and also all of the, personal conflict that they deal with individually over the course of that book. Like Levi is going through a lot, Anne is going through a lot. Trying to get them through all of that and then still end up together at the end was something that I knew going into the story I was not going to achieve, nor did I really want to. I'm a big fan of slow burn romances. I think it gives the characters time to breathe. It gives the relationship time to develop and marinate. And so yeah, I had always planned for it to be in book 2. I just felt like that gave the characters time that they needed individually to grow as people before they could actually grow together.
I felt so glad that I read the books after the second one had already come out so that I could go right into it and I didn't have to wait for that to happen. Over the course of the 3 books, what was your favorite Levi and Anne scene to write? Do you have one?
My favorite Levi and Anne scene. I have a few favorite ones, and they're all favorites for completely different reasons. I have one that's completely non-romantic, and that is the climax scene of Ace of Shades. I don't want to give too many spoilers about it, but it's a really high intense scene that involves a card game, and I had a lot of fun writing it. I would say that in Queen of Bolts, there is a particular scene that takes place during an interview that I had a lot of fun writing, especially because once it happened, it took me a little bit by surprise when I first drafted it, and then I had to go back and then make it work because I realized how exciting it was. I would say probably those 2. Also, any scene that involves them fighting. I'm a big fan of writing characters having arguments with one another. It's actually very hard for me not to constantly have my characters fighting. It's hard for them to get along.
That's funny. I like
So
that.
yeah, those always spur me
That
on.
that plays into what you were saying about the like antagonists to lovers thing, you know, that it's
Right,
like
yeah.
you're always right on that line between fighting and loving
Yeah, I like my characters to like emotionally eviscerate each other before
yeah, no, totally.
before anything juicy happens.
Absolutely. So obviously Levi and Anne are the focal point as far as romance, but there are so many good romances throughout this series. So who are some of your other favorite ones that you wrote about?
Yeah, so the Shadow Game series overall has an extremely, as you said, very large cast. And so there were a ton of different opportunities for kind of background romances, especially because Anne and Levi aren't the only point of view characters in the series. We do get to tap into the heads of some of the other characters throughout
Yeah.
each of the books. And I would say some of my favorite romantic pairings, I really, really enjoy Lola and Talk.
Hmm.
Talk is a new character who's introduced in King of Fools, and I absolutely love them together. Talk in general is one of my favorite characters to write. So just I wish her all the happiness in the world.
Yeah.
Then I would say I don't want to give too many spoilers, but I would say Harvey's endgame love interest in book 3. I feel like I can't spoil that because that love interest is in a completely different relationship in book 2. But them together, I also really, really enjoyed writing. I would say Jack and Sophia was another a big one that I love to write. Yes, as far as the romantic relationships go, for sure.
Okay, so I can tell you don't want to spoil things. So I'm going to tailor this next question. I don't want to give too much away, but I did want to ask you about this. I wanted to ask you about how you chose which characters were going to be the characters to die. And specifically in terms of their romances, I think there are two characters in particular whose partners kind of found their vulnerability, who are tough on the outside and kind of found their vulnerability through these relationships, and two of those characters by the end of the series. And I just wanted to know why that was important to the story, because it was like brutal to read. So
Yeah.
why is that important?
I would say so. Both of those were pretty different. I think the two character deaths that you were talking about were both very different to me when I was writing the story, because the one occurs in book 2, and so there is an entire book afterwards to explore what happened, whereas the other one occurs at the very, very end of the story. So there isn't a lot of space to kind of unpack it. It's kind of more of the finale. And I would say typically it came down to a few factors for me. For the first character in particular, it had to do with when I was looking into planning book 3 and realizing where all the characters needed to go and where they needed to be. And I just realized that that character really no longer had a place in the story. I felt like their story had kind of climaxed and it had reached its ending. And actually, when I initially drafted the second book, that character did not die. It took me it took me writing the entire novel and then planning the third one to really look at it and realize that I had written myself into a hole. Like I wasn't writing the right story anymore. So I would say that. I also think that for that death in particular, since there was a whole book afterwards, it really allowed me to explore the third book through the lens of trauma. You know, the series as a whole deals with a lot of high intense action scenes and political conflict and grief. And I didn't want to put my character through all this just for the fun of it. I don't I'm not the type of person who writes this story where all this stuff happens to these teenagers and then they come out of it like completely on their feet, 100% okay. And I felt like the other thing that the death of that character in book 2 allowed me to do in book 3 is it really shook the characters and the readers in a way that kind of it cast a harsher lens and a more realistic lens on the story. It wasn't just one of those fantasy novels where, you know, all this stuff happens with a bang and then we can just keep moving on because it's a book. It was like so surprising and shocking that it kind of forces you out of the story and then realizing like, oh no, like this shit has gotten really real. Like we need to really talk about this. And so it allowed me to kind of use the third book to explore things like trauma and grief and mental illness in a way that felt like the story needed, but I didn't think I could get to without having an event that would shock the readers who are already really familiar with the way that the genre works. And then for the character at the end of book 3, it was a mixture of a few things. I felt like I needed someone to die at the end of this book who wasn't just an antagonist character, because I didn't want to cheapen the death in book 2, because the stakes are even higher in book 3. So I felt like if I had the biggest death in the series occur when the stakes weren't at their highest, it might cheapen that death. And then came down mostly to a question of who was in the plot at the right time, like just the way the structure of it all worked out. How I wanted, as you were saying, the love interest of that character to kind of finish the series, especially characters that do find themselves a lot with another person. I think it's also important, especially when we're talking about young people, to then frame their relationships well. How are they then without that person? And so, yeah, it was a mixture of all those different factors. I'm also not the type of person who's trying to, a lot of the characters in the Shadow Game series are queer characters. And it is also really important to me to give queer characters happy endings. And so that kind of also, I would say, limited my options a little bit because it is such a queer cast. And even though there are definitely queer characters who die over the course of the series because it's a brutal series and there's so many queer characters, but I knew by the end like which ones I wanted to give that happy ending to, and that also kind of helped me narrow down my decision a little bit.
That's awesome. And that actually leads me to the last thing I wanted to say, which I literally wrote here. I'm not sure if there's a question in here, but I really loved the way that both gender and sexual fluidity are such a normal part of the writing throughout all the books and all the characters. And I wanted to kind of hear a little bit why that was so important to you, and if that's how you've always written, if that was specific to this series.
Yeah, so I'm a queer author, and growing up, I didn't really see a lot of books that were about issues like that weren't like what I would call like issue books. Like that was the whole point of the book. That's how they were put on shelves, and they were usually kind of like tragedy porn in some ways. And so it was really important to me to write a series that was going to be fully fantastical. It wasn't going to be some contempt issue book, and that completely took all of that in stride. That all these characters can be queer of some nature, and like that is not questioned in the story. And this world has no homophobia, it has no transphobia, it doesn't have anything like that. And so I liked that it was just this full sprawling fantasy series, and then it just happened to feature a lot of queer characters. It's exactly what I set out to write. It also is how I set out to write pretty much all of my books. My book that came out before the Shadow Game series, Daughter of the Burning City, also features a ton of queer characters in the same way. Books that I have coming out in the future also do the exact same thing. It's kind of my manifesto. I don't know if it's what I will always write, but it's definitely what I have written to date.
I think it's great. And I think if someone picks it up who, like you said, is used to only reading about these characters when that the focal point is that, we talked on our show a lot about how a movie like Love, Simon comes out, and it's like, it's a great movie, but it's a coming out story. It's not a rom-com. It's not the same as a rom-com. The whole movie is about that, and like that it's so different to just start from a place of everyone is who they are, everyone's accepting of who they are, and then just tell their stories.
No, I agree. And it's not that those books are not extremely important. I think it's more that I think of myself as a teenager, and I would have been really nervous to outwardly seek a book like that out. I would have been thinking like, are people going to read into this? Are people going to ask me like, oh, why are you reading that? And so I think those books are really important because they give visibility to the queer community in a major way. But at the same time, I think there is a lot of value to be found in kind of like under the radar queer representation of books that the cover doesn't necessarily clue you in to kind of what's going on within the pages. Plus, I think that members of the queer community deserve just escapist reads as well. Like, I think the topical books are important, and then the escapist books are also important. So I think all together they're great. But growing up, I felt like it was very weighted to one side of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This was awesome. Is there anything else while I have you here that you want to promote or let anybody know about as far as upcoming things or?
Yeah, I'll probably shout out some of the books that I have coming out in 2021. I have a middle grade series coming out in 2021. Obviously, I feel like on a romance podcast or romance YouTube, that's going to be kind of probably a little bit different, but I do have that coming out in 2021. It's called Wilderlore. And then my next YA novel, which is actually co-written with my best friend, Christine Lynn Herman. It's called All of Us Villains, and that's coming out in September of next year.
Amazing. Sounds awesome. Well, thank you so much for being the first guest on Love Bytes.
Thank you.
I can't wait to read what comes out next.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
The Shipping Room is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Find more podcasts you'll love at frolic.media/podcasts.